Question 51. In Antonio Gramsci's definition of intellectual, which is the correct option? A. Every social group joining the world of production creates organically a strata of intellectuals. B. Intellectuals give homogeneity and awareness of a social group's function in all the fields. C. Intellectuals do not work for consolidating the power of a social group. D. The category of ecclesiastics is organically bound to the bourgeoisie. E. The monopoly held by the ecclesiastics in the superstructural domain was not exercised without a contestation. The right answer is 3. A, B, and E only, because these choices fit perfectly with what Antonio Gramsci thought about intellectuals and how culture dominates society, just like the breakdown you've got. A is spot on because Gramsci talked about how every group in society ends up creating its own intellectuals. These folks come from the same background as the group, but step up to handle all the ideology stuff. It's like each class naturally brings up its own thinkers and leaders, which is key for the UGC NET exam because it digs into how social structures influence cultural roles. B makes sense too. Gramsci believed intellectuals were crucial for keeping a social group together and aware of their position and power in society. He thought these intellectuals were essential in voicing what everyday people felt and wanted, helping to strengthen their group's influence. This point is a big deal for the UGC NET since it deals with the impact of culture and ideas on societal cohesion. E might not be straight up mentioned, but it fits with Gramsci's general criticism of how culture, especially religion, helps maintain the status quo. He was all about pointing out how traditional roles, like the churches, were challenged, which is a subtle but important aspect to understand for the UGC NET exam, particularly in discussions about cultural dynamics and power. Why the other choices don't make the cut. C doesn't line up because Gramsci actually argued that intellectuals are key to building and keeping their group's power through cultural dominance. Saying otherwise goes against his main point. D misses the mark a bit. While Gramsci did look at how intellectuals interact with different social classes, saying that religious leaders are just tied to the upper class oversimplifies his broader ideas about culture and power relations. This kind of breakdown is crucial for UGC NET prep, as it shows deep understanding of cultural theories and their applications. Antonio Gramsci was a big deal in Marxist thinking, really diving deep into how culture and ideas shape society through what he called cultural hegemony. Basically, he noticed that every social group comes up with its own set of thinkers or intellectuals right from its own roots. These folks don't just go with the flow, they shape thoughts and culture, which is super important for the UGC NET exam because it tests your understanding of how cultural forces mold societies. Gramsci wasn't just talking about the obvious ways societies are controlled. He was interested in how societies kind of agree to be led through shared values, which usually come from the top, the bourgeoisie. He thought that if the working class could develop its own set of values and intellectuals, they could challenge the dominant ways of thinking. This idea is crucial for the UGC NET, especially if you're diving into how cultural norms are built and maintained. He also had a lot to say about religion, especially the Roman Catholic Church, and how it kept the upper class values going strong. He thought Marxism could fill the spiritual void left if people moved away from the church. Gramsci's push for education that reflects real-life experiences and promotes critical thinking among the masses highlights the need for what he called organic intellectuals, people from within the working class who could help build a new cultural direction. This perspective is super relevant for those studying educational theory and critical theory for the UGC NET exam. In terms of the bigger picture, here's what you got to know about Gramsci's ideas for the UGC NET. Cultural hegemony is all about how the elite keep their power, not just through force, but through cultural norms and values. The importance of education that really speaks to workers, helping to raise intellectuals among them. The contrast between political society, like the police and legal stuff, which controls through force, and civil society, like schools and families, where control is more about consent and cultural norms. Absolute historicism, which basically means understanding history as constantly changing and shaped by human actions. He critiqued the idea that economics alone drives society, which challenges some traditional Marxist views. He was critical of materialism, arguing that understanding the world requires more than just looking at the physical and economic aspects. These are key concepts in Marxist theory that come up a lot in exams like the UGC NET, because they challenge you to think about how power and culture intersect in real and theoretical ways. Question 52. The term simulacra in postmodern discourse is about A. Absence of vivid representation of reality. B. Artificially produced reality dubbed as authentic. C. A rejection of modernistic view of reality. D. The gap between the perception and reality. E. The psychological interplay at the level of subconscious minor. Ready for the answer? 3 and B only. Here's a quick explanation. In postmodern discourse, simulacra refers to copies of reality that either don't represent something real or are considered genuine despite being artificial. Simulacra and Simulation, written by Jean Baudrillard in 1981, really digs into how we mix up reality, symbols, and the cultural and media imagery that shapes what we think is real. This book is all about figuring out how these elements come together to mold our collective sense of what's happening around us. So when Baudrillard talks about simulacra, he's referring to copies or versions of things that don't actually have a real original or have replaced their originals to the point where you can't tell the difference anymore. And simulation is about mimicking how real-world stuff works, but doing it over and over. Baudrillard's take on simulacra is super crucial for understanding how postmodern thinkers look at reality and its representations. These days, with all the tech and media around us, it's getting really hard to spot where the real stuff ends and the artificial begins. Baudrillard says that we're living in a world filled with simulacra, where the fake stuff is treated as real, option B. It's like the fake is so good that we accept it as the real deal, completely hiding the fact that the real might not even be there anymore. Also, the idea that there's an absence of a vivid representation of reality, option A, really gets to the heart of what Baudrillard was talking about with simulacra. Our world is so full of symbols and signs that reality and its replicas are getting tangled up, making it tough to find any true reality. He describes this crazy situation where symbols like maps come before and even create what we think of as real, like territories, leading us to a point where our sense of what's real is always coming through filters and reconstructions. This whole concept that simulacra are both a lack of clear reality and artificially made realities that we see as legit is a big topic in postmodern talks. Baudrillard's points show how our traditional ideas of what's real have been flipped by simulations ruling our view of the world. This messes with the old school belief that reality is something solid and clear-cut, suggesting instead that much of what we think of as real is just constructed by our media-saturated culture. For the UGC NET exam, understanding this could really help if you're diving into questions on media, culture, and how they shape our perceptions. Baudrillard pushes us to think about how much of our understanding of the world is just built from layers of images and stories that shape what we see as truth, questioning the roots and authenticity of our experiences and knowledge. Question 53. Roland Barthes, in his Introduction to the Structural Analysis of Narratives, 1966, proposed 3 levels of narrative structure. Which among the following are the narrative structures proposed by him? A. Functions. B. Actions. C. Grammar. Narration. E. Coherence. All right, let's reveal the answer. A, B, and D. Only time to unpack this. Barthes broke down narratives into functions, actions, and the overarching narration itself, focusing on how elements build the story structure. In Roland Barthes' Introduction to the Structural Analysis of Narrative, he really zooms in on how sentence structure plays into the bigger story. Using a linguistics angle to break down narratives, he sorts the whole narrative structure into 3 levels: functions, actions, and narrative. Starting at the bottom, functions are like the basic building blocks. Think of simple descriptive words that help paint a picture of a character. Then, as you move up, these characters evolve into actions, which are key to driving the plot forward. Barthes shows how certain functions combine to craft a character. For example, mixing words like dark, mysterious, and odd can create a pretty intriguing figure or action. By splitting narratives into these bits, Barthes digs into how realism is built into stories and how these elements mold the action. This approach is all about peeling back the layers of storytelling to expose the tricks hidden in mainstream culture. Roland Barthes was a big name in French literary theory, not just sticking to one field, but dabbling in everything from essays to philosophy and criticism, with a keen interest in signs and symbols as seen in Western pop culture. His influence sprawled across structuralism, anthropology, literary theory, and even post-structuralism. He really made waves with his essay collection Mythologies in 1957, where he dissected modern myths built into everyday life and social values. Another major hit was The Death of the Author around 1967-1968, where he flipped traditional literary criticism on its head. During a bit of a tiff with a professor from Sorbonne, Raymond Picard, Barthes defended new ways of thinking against the old school, stuffy criticism in his work Criticism and Truth in 1966. Pushing back against the existentialist vibe of 1940s France, especially against Jean-Paul Sartre's ideas in What is Literature, Barthes looked for fresh and unique angles in writing. In his 1953 piece, Writing Degree Zero, he argued that writing isn't just about what you say, but how you play around with language and style conventions. For anyone diving into the UGC NET exam, getting a grip on Barthes' methods and theories can be super useful, especially if you're looking into narrative structures, literary theory, or the sociology of literature. His work challenges you to think differently about how stories and texts influence and reflect cultural norms, which is key for acing questions on theory and criticism. Mythologies really digs into how modern myths are made, looking at the signs and symbols that shape these stories, building on what Ferdinand de Saussure started with his sign analysis. Barthes really shook things up with The Death of the Author in 1967, where he argues that hanging on to the idea that an author controls the ultimate meaning of a text doesn't really hold up because language is too complex and we can't ever fully know what's going on in an author's head. In SZ from 1970, Barthes takes a close look at Balzac's Sarracine through a structuralist lens, breaking down different layers of meaning like the hermeneutic, proeretic, semic, symbolic, and cultural codes. This book was a game changer for how people thought about texts, blending structuralism with the newer vibes of post-structuralism. Then there's The Pleasure of the Text in 1973, where he sorts out his thoughts on what makes reading enjoyable or profound. He introduces us to the idea of readerly and writerly texts, pushing for the importance of the latter because they constantly challenge and renew our understanding as they're put together. Getting the hang of Roland Barthes and his big ideas can really pay off in the UGC NET English exam. As a French literary theorist, Barthes picked apart how signs make up our world and influenced a bunch of areas like structuralism, anthropology, literary theory, and post-structuralism. His works, especially Mythologies and The Death of the Author, are super relevant. If you get why he critiqued traditional literary criticism and how he broke down texts in SZ, you're in a great spot for tackling exam questions. A solid grasp of Barthes's theories is a smart move since his concepts pop up a lot in the UGC NET English. Question 54. Which of the following is true about Arthur Miller's plays? A. After the Fall is a semi-autobiographical play. Incident of Vichy deals with Nazi prosecution of the Jews. C. The Price anticipates economic crash. D. The Creation of the World is not a seriocomic rewriting of the story of Jesus. E. The Crucible uses a specific setting to consider the responsibilities of the artist. And the answer is 3. And B. Only. Let's dig into why. After the Fall explores themes from Miller's own life, and Incident at Vichy directly addresses the Nazi persecution. A. After the Fall is one of Arthur Miller's more personal plays, where he gets real about his own tough times, especially after his split from Marilyn Monroe. The play focuses on Quentin, a Jewish guy in New York who's also dealing with life after a divorce. It's a deep dive into introspection, kind of like Miller sorting through his own feelings about his failed marriage. B. Incident at Vichy, written in 1964, is a gripping one-act play that throws us into a chilling situation in Vichy, France during 1942, where men are detained for racial checks. Through this, Miller explores the darker sides of human nature, like guilt, fear, and why people didn't really fight back during the Holocaust. It's a powerful look at some grim historical truths and what they say about morality. C. The Price, from 1967, is all about family drama and the long shadows that past choices cast over our lives. The story picks up with Victor Franz coming back to sell his family's stuff 30 years after the Great Depression hit them hard. The play unpacks a ton of family tension and what personal sacrifices mean in the grand scheme of things. Miller really makes you think about the consequences of the choices we make. C. In The Creation of the World and Other Business, 1972, Miller switches gears and goes for laughs while tackling the hefty themes of good versus evil. It's a fun spin on the Genesis story, poking at temptation and the messiness of human nature with a good dose of humor. It shows off how versatile Miller can be, mixing deep topics with comedy. D. The Crucible, penned in 1953 and set during the Salem witch trials, isn't just a history lesson. It's a sharp critique of the fear and conformity that swept through America during the McCarthy era. The play keeps proving its worth by staying relevant, speaking to the fears and societal pressures that still pop up today. Diving into Arthur Miller's plays is a must if you're prepping for the UGC NET English exam. You're likely to see questions about his works, which dive into themes, characters, and historical settings. Question 55. Which of the following statements concepts are relevant for understanding of postmodernism? A. Postmodernism and postcolonialism are mutually dependent in responding to colonial experience. B. Lyotard argues that the postmodern condition is characterized by a deeply felt skepticism towards meta-narratives. C. Edward W. Said has been instrumental in postmodern theory and criticism. D. Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulations is a seminal postmodern text. E. Frederick Jameson argues that parody has been replaced by pastiche in postmodernism. The right pick here is 1B, D, E, and E only. And here's how key postmodern thinkers back that up. B. Jean-François Lyotard really shook things up with his ideas in the postmodern condition. He's all about questioning those big sweeping stories, called grand narratives, that try to explain everything under the sun. This doubt is a huge part of what postmodernism is about. D. Jean Baudrillard dives into something called hyperreality in his work Simulacra and Simulations. It's this idea that fake representations of reality start to feel more real than actual reality, a super important concept in postmodern thought. E. Frederick Jameson sees postmodernism as what comes with the territory of advanced capitalism. He talks about how, in today's culture, parody, which usually has some bite, has been replaced by pastiche, a kind of bland imitation. This reflects how our sense of history and personal identity is getting blurry, which is a big deal in postmodern circles. Why the other answers don't fit. A. Postmodernism and postcolonialism might seem like buddies because they both challenge old-school Western ideas, but they're not the same thing. Postcolonialism gets into the nitty-gritty of colonial impacts and legacies, while postmodernism is more about questioning the big stories we're told about progress and what's real. They cross paths, but they're different beasts. Edward W. Said is a heavyweight in postcolonial studies thanks to his book Orientalism, where he calls out how the West views the East. He's not really a postmodernism guy. His stuff is crucial for understanding postcolonial studies, not so much for postmodern theory. For the UGC NET exam, getting why these thinkers and their ideas matter is key, especially if you're diving into questions about literary theories and cultural studies. Understanding these distinctions can really give you an edge when tackling the theory part of the exam. Postmodern literature is like a wild mix of storytelling tricks. Think metafiction, unreliable narrators, and a whole lot of references to other texts. It popped up big time in the 1960s in the US, with authors like Kurt Vonnegut, Thomas Pynchon, and John Barth. These guys were all about challenging the usual ways of thinking, which totally matched the vibe of political upheaval and counterculture trends of their time. So in a way, their work mirrors the messy, complex world around them. This whole postmodern vibe isn't totally new, though. It's got roots in older, quirky works like Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote and Laurence Stern's Tristram Shandy. But the 60s and 70s really set the stage for this style to shine, and it's still evolving today with writers like Dave Eggers and Jennifer Egan, who keep pushing the envelope on how stories can be told. Postmodernism isn't just about books. It stretches into architecture, philosophy, and films too, and you can split it into three big chunks. Postmodernity, which is all about cultural shifts, theoretical postmodernism, which folks like Roland Barthes and Michel Foucault dig into, and cultural postmodernism, which is where all the artsy stuff, including literature and movies, come into play. Postmodern literature fits right into this last category, shaking up the storytelling scene with its clever twists and deep themes. Jean-François Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, a report on knowledge from 1979, really gets into how we think about knowledge in these modern times, ditching those big, all-explaining stories that used to dominate. His honest take on struggling to fully get the sciences just shows how tricky it is to pin down what we know in this complex era. Fredric Jameson sees postmodernism as a sign we're moving from the old industrial vibes to an info-heavy society, while Jean Baudrillard talks about hyperreality, where it's getting harder to tell real from fake because our society is so focused on media and tech. These thinkers help outline the main points of postmodern thought: skepticism of big narratives, the rise of simulations, and a shift from biting satire to more neutral mimicry, all painting a detailed picture of our culture today. Question 56. Which of the following statements are valid for post-colonial theory and literature? A. Abrogation, resistance, and assertion form the basis of post-colonial thought. B. Post-colonial theory defends binaries of master and slave, white and black, and colonizer and colonized. C. Weep Not, Child is the first novel in English by an East African writer, Ngugi wa Thiong'o D. Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys is based on the experiences of colonized African population. E. Homi K. Bhabha, Edward W. Said, and Gayatri Spivak are important post-colonial thinkers. So here's the answer: 3A, C, and E only. Let's dive into the explanations. Post-colonial theory often involves questioning and overturning established narratives and figures, celebrates firsts in literature, such as Ngugi's novel, and is shaped by key thinkers like Bhabha, Said, and Spivak. Post-colonial literature comes from places that were once under someone else's rule, pretty much everywhere except Antarctica. This genre digs into the messy aftermath of countries shaking off colonial rule, looking at how people reclaim their political and cultural power, and dealing with heavy stuff like racism and the leftover impacts of colonialism. Literary theories here really get into how these writings either push back against or sometimes even uphold cultural imperialism, a big idea talked up by critic Edward Said. In Orientalism, 1978, Edward Said takes a hard look at how authors like Honoré de Balzac, Charles Baudelaire, and Lautréamont, Isidore Lucien Ducasse, were influenced by and also perpetuated European ideas of being better than others. Said's work is super important because it started a whole new way of analyzing how colonial power dynamics are baked into literature. Then there's Homi K. Bhabha from Harvard, who throws a bunch of key ideas into the mix, like hybridity, third space, mimicry, difference, and ambivalence. He and others like him take these tools to reread classic Western books by big names like Shakespeare and Jane Austen, pointing out the colonial vibes lurking in those texts. Nowadays, the critics in this field are all about exploring how literature fights against colonial narratives. They use cool concepts like anti-conquest, national unity, negritude, Pan-Africanism, and post-colonial feminism to peel apart how books portray anti-colonial resistance. Some of the stars in this area include Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, Frantz Fanon, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Chinua Achebe, among others, each adding their own spice to understanding post-colonial theory. For the UGC NET exam, getting a handle on post-colonial literature and its theories is a big win if you're prepping for the exam. Questions often dive into how post-colonial perspectives shed light on historical and cultural contexts, especially through literary criticism. So grasping these ideas can really boost your game when you face those theory questions. Weep Not, Child, a novel by Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, hit the shelves in 1964 under his then name, James Ngugi. It's a pretty big deal because it's the first English novel from an East African. The story digs into the tensions between locals and white settlers in Kenya during the colonial times, with a big focus on the Mau Mau uprising and how the indigenous folks were losing their ancestral lands. Ngugi wrote this while he was a student at Makerere University, and he didn't hold back in criticizing the whole colonial power play. Wide Sargasso Sea by Dominican-British author Jean Rhys came out in 1966 and serves as a post-colonial and feminist backstory to Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. It tells the tale of Antoinette Causeway, who you might remember as the madwoman in the attic from Bronte's book. This novel walks us through her life from her younger days in Jamaica to her rocky marriage with Mr. Rochester. He renames her Bertha, declares her insane, and locks her away in his English home. The book really opens up at the rough ride she has with gender roles, racial identity, and fitting in, showing how she's torn between her Caribbean roots and European society. For the UGC NET exam, these novels are staples when studying post-colonial literature, so they're super relevant for the UGC NET English exam. Weep Not Child and Wide Sargasso Sea are excellent for exploring themes like colonial impact, racial and cultural identity, and resistance, which are hot topics on the test. Knowing these works well can really help you nail those questions about literary contexts and themes. Question 57. Which of the following is true of Edward Said's Orientalism? A. It was published in 1979. B. Utilizes the concept of discursive formulation as argued by Foucault. C. He has taken up the detailed analysis of imaginative geography and representation of the Orient. D. It is one of the foundational texts of postcolonial theory. E. It puts to use Barthes' concept of death of the author. And the answer is 4, B, C, and D only. Let's unpack this. Said's work uses Foucault's framework to analyze the West's constructed perceptions of the Orient and is foundational to postcolonial studies. Orientalism by Edward W. Said, which hit the shelves in 1978, really shakes things up by introducing the concept of Orientalism as a scholarly tool for critique. This idea piggybacks on some heavy-duty critical methods initially brewed up by the philosopher Michel Foucault. Said goes hard on how the West has often gotten it wrong when depicting Eastern societies and cultures, pointing out that there's a lot of made-up stuff shaping how people see places like Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. He calls this imagined geographies, meaning folks have formed ideas about these places based mainly on images, texts, or talk that don't really reflect reality. Said argues that this skewed view has propped up imperial and colonial attitudes, basically saying that a lot of Western scholarly work on the Orient has backed up some pretty oppressive power structures. He also mentions how some Middle Eastern big shots have kind of bought into this Western-made romantic version of Arab culture. Said isn't just theorizing. He dives into colonial literature, like stuff by Joseph Conrad, to show how these exotic narratives mix people, time, and place into one big romantic illusion. His approach is super post-structuralist, which means he's all about analyzing the structures and assumptions that underpin how we think and talk about stuff. Orientalism has been a game changer in fields like literary theory, cultural criticism, and especially Middle Eastern studies, where it's kicked off a lot of new ways of looking at the region. It's become a cornerstone in post-colonial studies, pushing scholars to take a hard look at how they study the Middle East. For the UGC NET exam, understanding Orientalism is crucial if you're tackling the UGC NET English exam, especially in the areas of post-colonial literature and theory. Grasping Said's critique of how the West views the East can give you a solid edge in answering questions about post-colonial perspectives and the theoretical frameworks that support them. This book is a must-know as it's foundational to post-colonial studies and pops up a lot in discussions about literature and culture in academic settings. Orientalism really dives into the long history and the sticky meanings tied to how the West views the East. It even takes a look at the histories of countries after they've shaken off colonial rule, pointing out how Western scholarship often gets political when talking about Eastern spots. The book throws some serious shade on whether you can ever really be objective in Oriental studies. Gayatri Spivak chats about cultural politics in her book In Other Worlds. Her famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, tackles how post-colonial voices often get drowned out. Homi K. Baba takes us through how nations tell their own stories in Nation and Narration. Ronald Inden questions what we think we know about India in Imagining India. John Prakash gets into how historians should rethink Third World history post-Orientalism. Nicholas Dirks digs into how colonial history has shaped ideas about caste in India in Castes of Mind. Hamid Dabashi tells the story of Iran in Iran, a people, and Robert Young breaks down post-colonial theory in white mythologies, confirming that Orientalism has really influenced how the Middle East is studied. Even though Orientalism didn't focus much on Orientalist paintings, Linda Nochlin applied Said's ideas to that kind of art too. The whole approach is heavily inspired by Michel Foucault's ways of tearing apart how we analyze stuff. Talal Asad criticizes how Orientalism sets itself up as the authority, noting it's kind of stuck in a loop, just confirming what it already assumes. Orientalism is all about calling out the messed up Western ideas about Arabs and Muslims. Prakash sees Orientalism as the backdrop for all the imperial stuff in scholarship, pointing out the darker sides of these studies. He's pretty blunt. Without imperialism, there'd be no Orientalist studies. Said's book doesn't just challenge the harsh stereotypes. It ties academic work right back to the power plays of colonial times. Question 58. Identify the correct option in Julia Kristeva's definition of Kora. A. Liminal space. B. Space of the marginalized. C. Non-expressive totality created by the bodily drives. D. The Kora has no fixed identity. E. It precedes the linguistic sign ready for the answer. 2. C, D, and E only. Here's why. Kristeva's concept of Kora refers to a pre-linguistic, undefined realm driven by the body, without a fixed identity and existing before language forms. Kora in the world of semiotics and philosophy. Plato first talked about Kora in his work Timaeus as this sort of third kind, a special, formless space or gap that serves like a container or backdrop. This space lets the perfect forms from the world of ideas show up in our everyday, tangible world. It's kind of a mysterious in-between space, almost like it doesn't fully exist, that helps these forms make the leap into reality. Plato even uses motherly images to describe it, painting it as a nurturing space. Julia Kristeva took this concept of Kora and ran with it in a slightly different direction to talk about the early stages of human development, particularly focusing on the deep connection between a mother and her child during their initial time apart. She describes Kora as this foundational space where the child first starts to engage with the semiotic realm. This is all about tones and movements rather than clear-cut language. This stage is super important because it's before the kid starts really talking and taking on a social identity, marking the shift from being seen as just an extension of the mom to becoming their own person in society. Julia Kristeva, who's a big name in the fields of linguistics, psychoanalysis, and feminist thought, really dives into how Kora separates the semiotic from the symbolic. In her view, Kora offers a break from the male-dominated symbolic activities, suggesting it as a space that you can sort of map out but can't fully define. It's about those moments and processes before things get pinned down by language. Kristeva really zones in on the maternal vibes, highlighting those early, pre-Oedipal connections and urges towards the mom, which is a bit of a shift from the usual Freudian and Lacanian emphasis on dad's role, language, and symbolic castration in shaping a person. She uses Kora, a concept she borrowed from Plato's Timaeus, where it's like a container for change and becoming, kind of like a womb, to dig into these early shaping processes. In Plato's thinking, Kora is different from the real, illusion-packed world we see and the perfect world of unchanging forms. It's more like the birthplace of both what we perceive and think. Kristeva's spin on this is all about showing how important mom and the pre-symbolic stages are in developing who we are. Martin Heidegger talks about Kora as a clearing where existence sort of unfolds, and Kitaro Nishida, also taking cues from Plato, shapes his idea of basho, place, around Kora, likening it to the deep concept of mu, which is all about a fundamental nothingness. Jacques Derrida dives into Kora to talk about a kind of radical otherness that's essential for anything to actually exist, framing it as this vague gap that's key for any form to pop up. Derrida's take on Kora is all about dodging the usual labels and either-or thinking, and it's super in line with his whole deconstructive vibe of trying to understand what life and meaning are all about. Kristeva's intertextuality idea. Julia Kristeva comes up with intertextuality to blend Saussure's ideas on signs with Bakhtin's thoughts on dialogue, stressing how meanings are not fixed but come from the interaction of multiple texts. She believes that meanings bubble up in the conversations happening between texts, not just handed straight from writer to reader. Intertextuality suggests that a text's meaning isn't locked up tight within it, but comes alive through its connections to other texts. This view, also pushed by Roland Barthes, is all about seeing literature as a big conversation between different texts and traditions, with readers piecing together meanings through a web of textual references. For the UGC NET exam, getting the lowdown on these ideas is super helpful for the UGC NET exam, especially if you're diving into questions about literary theory. Understanding Kristeva's take on Cora, Derrida's approach to deconstructing being, and the whole concept of intertextuality can give you a strong edge in tackling complex theoretical questions and discussions about how literature works. This knowledge is crucial for anyone looking to explore deep literary or philosophical themes. Question 59. Choose the correct option in the light of the following statement. The fact that I am a black working-class man will determine my worldview just as much and perhaps far more than I consciously learn in the domain of ideas. A man is capable of making free choices in the sphere of intellection and morality. B. The unconscious determines human thought and behavior. C. Man is condemned to be free. D. We bear a form of otherness within ourselves. E. We can no longer talk unequivocally of a writer's intention. The right answer here is 1, B, D, and E. Only because the statement really stresses how much our social identity, like being a black working-class man, can shape how we see things, maybe even more than the stuff we consciously pick up from ideas floating around. Here's why each choice fits. B. The unconscious determines human thought and behavior. This one hits the nail on the head by saying that things we're not even fully aware of, like where we come from or the traits we're born with, seriously shape our thoughts and actions. D. We bear a form of otherness within ourselves. This option connects with the statement by pointing out that our own unique social identity brings its own kind of perspective or otherness to the table, deeply coloring how we interpret everything around us. E. We can no longer talk unequivocally of a writer's intention. This choice ties in by recognizing that a writer's background, stuff like their race and class, really molds their outlook and naturally their writing. So, trying to pin down a writer's intention as if it's just one thing kind of misses the complex mix of unseen influences tied to their identity. Together, these options really drive home the idea that our thoughts and creativity are closely woven with both our social and personal identity, which work behind the scenes both consciously and unconsciously. Here's why the other statements don't quite fit. A. Man is capable of making free choices in the sphere of intellection and morality, suggests that we can make completely free and conscious choices, ignoring how our background or unseen biases can sneak into our decisions. This overlooks the powerful influence our personal histories have on what we think are free choices in terms of our thinking and morals. C. Man is condemned to be free, which comes from existentialist philosophy, especially from Jean-Paul Sartre, talks about the heavy responsibility of having total freedom and the need to make choices without any preset meaning. This idea doesn't really tackle how our social identity and stuff we're not conscious of might limit or influence our sense of freedom or the way we see the world, which makes it less relevant to the main point. For the UGC NET exam, getting why these choices are considered incorrect helps in the UGC NET exam, particularly when you're diving into questions about philosophy and literature. It's crucial to recognize how different philosophical views address or fail to address the role of identity and unconscious influences in shaping our thoughts and decisions. Understanding these distinctions can help you critically analyze texts and theories in the exam. Question 60. According to Sigmund Freud, civilization is to some extent the cumulative product of our psychology. Choose the correct options. A. The purpose of human life is the pursuit of happiness. B. Man is wholly good. C. Abolition of private property will remove ill will and hostility among men. D. Creative art reflects the purpose of human life. E. Civilization is analogous with the human psyche. And here's the answer. 3A, D, and E. Only time to explain. Freud saw the pursuit of happiness as a core human drive, linked the creation of art to fulfilling human desires, and considered civilization as deeply intertwined with our psychological structure. Civilization and Its Discontents is a big deal book by Sigmund Freud, the guy who really got the ball rolling on psychoanalysis. written in 1929 and first out in German in 1930 as Das Unbehagen in der Kultur, which translates to the uneasiness in civilization. It digs into the tough tug-of-war Freud saw between people wanting to be themselves and what society expects from them. Historian Peter Gay in 1989 called it one of the most influential and heavily studied works in modern psychology. Here's the scoop. Freud thinks our main gig in life is chasing happiness. He's all about the pleasure principle, which is our drive to seek pleasure and happiness. A big point he makes is about the clash between what we want as individuals and what society expects from us. He talks about the ego developing over this oceanic feeling, which is feeling whole, limitless, and eternal. This oceanic feeling is kind of like a throwback to an earlier, simpler state of mind. Religion pops up as a way people try to deal less with the world's rough spots. Civilization's supposed to keep us from being unhappy, but it turns out it also makes us unhappy. Freud admits that civilization has to put happiness on the back burner to keep everything running smoothly. He's mixed about science and tech, seeing them as both good and bad for our happiness. Civilization aims to meet ideals like control, beauty, cleanliness, and order. He compares building a civilization to how we grow up, suggesting it sort of skirts around our natural feelings and desires. He even ties the development of civilization to humans starting to walk upright. There's this heavy reference to an old-school Oedipal drama where brothers team up to take out their dad. Our love for one person spreads out to everyone in our culture and humanity. Freud introduces this idea that we all have a real aggressive drive inside us. This aggressive side fights against our love side, which tries to keep society together. He splits the idea of libido into two instincts, the lovey-dovey eros and the self-focused thanatos. Thanatos is all about leaning towards destruction and death. Holding back the death drive can mess us up, leading to neurosis. Society squashes a kid's natural aggression, which turns inward and messes us up inside, causing neurosis. This built-up aggressive energy turns into the superego, which slaps our ego around for stepping out of line. We end up feeling guilty as the cost of getting along in families and communities. This guilt makes us anxious or gives us a sense of discontent. Freud talks about a cultural superego that acts like a conscience for society. He suggests society should go easy on the demands it makes on us, kind of like his advice for folks dealing with neurosis. In the end, he reflects on the never-ending struggle between eros, love, and thanatos, destructive drive, in all of us. Here's a laid-back breakdown of some psychoanalytic terms from Freud's world. Analysand, someone who's getting psychoanalyzed. Cathexis, it's when you channel your energy or libido, that's basically drive or desire toward a particular thing or goal. Displacement, a way to cope where you shift desires that might not be okay to ones that are more socially acceptable. Ego, this part of your psyche handles the reality stuff, keeping things real. Id, all about your basic instincts and operates without you even knowing. Yep, that's the unconscious. Libido, this is the energy coming from your sexual desires. Neurosis, a type of mental disorder where reality gets bent but not completely ditched. Organic, this refers to brain issues that come from actual physical injuries or diseases you can spot. Oedipus complex, those deep-seated, kind of taboo wishes and beliefs stemming from childhood issues Freud was big on. Physiology, the science of how the body systems do their thing. Physicalism, materialism, a belief that everything happening can be explained by physical stuff and how it interacts. Pleasure principle, the Ide's drive to satisfy basic desires and wishes, like a little kid wanting everything now. Projection, when you take stuff you don't like about yourself and assume it's true about others. Psychoanalyst, someone who does psychoanalysis. Psycho, Freud's method for treating mental issues by diving into what our unconscious desires are saying. Psychosis, serious mental disorders where there's a total break from what's actually real. Reaction formation, it's when you flip an unacceptable desire into its complete opposite. Reality principle, the ego's job to find a balance between what the ID wants right now and what can actually be done without causing a mess. Repression, how the ego tries to keep the lid on desires and thoughts we're not so proud of. Sublimation, channeling the energy from those not-so-great desires into something positive or socially acceptable. Superego, the part of you that's all about the moral standards and rules we've picked up from society. Here's a casual rundown of Sigmund Freud's key works, which pretty much set the foundation for understanding psychoanalysis. On Aphasia, 1891, early work where he dives into language and brain issues. Studies on Hysteria, co-authored with Josef Breuer, 1895. They explore hysteria, which Freud believed was rooted in suppressed trauma. The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899. Freud's famous book where he argues that dreams are the royal road to understanding the unconscious. On Dreams, 1901. A shorter version of the above, focusing on dream analysis. The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, 1904, looks at how everyday slip-ups and forgetfulness point to the workings of the unconscious. Jokes and their relation to the unconscious, 1905, how jokes can reveal what's really going on in our minds. 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, 1900, outlines his theories on sexual development and instincts. 5 lectures on psychoanalysis, 1910, a series of talks giving a solid intro to his theories. Leonardo da Vinci, A Memory of His Childhood, 1910, a psychoanalytic study of da Vinci's childhood. Totem and Taboo, 1913, Schrer compares the psychological lives of savages and neurotics. Introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, 1915-17. More in-depth lectures on his main theories. Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, introduces his ideas of the death drive alongside the pleasure principle. Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, 1921, how group dynamics impact the ego. The Ego and the Id, 1923, explores the interactions between the ego, ID, and superego. Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety, 1926, discusses how anxiety relates to psychological inhibitions and symptoms. The Question of Lay Analysis, 1926, defends the practice of psychoanalysis by non-doctors. The Future of an Illusion, 1927, Freud's thoughts on religion as an illusion that fulfills psychological needs. Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930, discusses the discontent that civilization imposes on individuals. New Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis, 1933, updates his theories for a new audience. Moses and Monotheism, 1939, Freud's take on the origins of Judaism and anti-Semitism. An Outline of Psychoanalysis, 1940, a concise guide to psychoanalytic theory. Thomas Woodrow Wilson, A Psychological Study with William C. Bullitt, 1967, a posthumous psychoanalytic take on the American president. Personal note for UGC NET exam, getting the hang of Freud's terms and his major works is super important if you're preparing for the UGC NET English exam. These concepts are foundational in psychoanalysis and pop up a lot in literary theory too. Regularly reviewing these works and understanding their implications can really give you an edge on exam day, especially when you're dealing with questions that involve psychological theories or analyzing texts.